The airfield outside Peking. It is a very cold, clear, dry morning. The air is full of static electricity. No airplanes are arriving. There is the odd note of birdsong. Finally, from behind some buildings, come the sounds of troops marching. Contingents of Army, Navy, and Air Force, 120 men each, circle the field and begin to sing an old Red Army ballad, the 3 main rules of discipline and the 8 points of attention. A jet is heard approaching, touching down, and taxiing across the runway. As the Spirit of 76 comes into view, slowing to a stop, Premier Zhou Enlai and a small group of officials stroll out to meet it, casting long shadows in the pale yellow light. A ramp is drawn up to the hatchway. After a pause, the door opens, and President Nixon stands in the opening for an instant, then begins to descend the ramp, closely followed by the First Lady, wearing a scarlet coat. When the President reaches the middle of the ramp, Premier Zhou begins to clap, and the President stops short and returns the gesture. According to the Chinese custom, he reaches the bottom step and extends his right hand as he walks towards the Premier. They shake hands. Such was the scene on the stage of the Houston Grand Opera House, where Nixon in China first debuted on October 22, 1987, in a production directed by Peter Sellers. The opera is a heroic, almost mythic portrayal of President Richard Nixon's 1972 trip to China, with music by minimalist composer John Adams and libretto by poet Alice Goodman. Sellers had won acclaim for his staging of classic operas in contemporary settings, from Don Giovanni in Spanish Harlem, styled as a blaxploitation film, to The Marriage of Figaro, set in a New York high-rise, evocative of Trump Tower. It was his idea to stage an opera around a recent historical event, and he approached Adams after hearing the composer's Shaker Loops. Goodman, a Harvard contemporary of Sellers, was brought on to write the libretto for the opera. She began her research by going over biographical and historical materials published before 1972, to capture the event as it was perceived at the time, and not how it was viewed retrospectively. She explained, "Having started out blissfully ignorant, I was not going to become wise after the fact. I read Agnes Smedley's biography of Zhu De, Edgar Snow's Red Star over China, The Dream of the Red Chamber, and the richly purple prose of Han Su-yen." Snow's book was one of the first to give a first-hand account of communist China in English. Snow was a young journalist who spent time with the Chinese communists during the revolution. His book tells the story of Mao, whom he portrayed almost as a Chinese Abraham Lincoln, whose land reform was like the Homestead Act. Dream of the Red Chamber, written in the 18th century, is an autobiographical novel that portrays the life of a large family and provided the opera with its recurring theme of the role of the ancestors in Chinese life. All 3 collaborators agreed that the depiction of Nixon and Mao should be serious and not a caricature of either. To understand why anyone would want to make an opera like Nixon in China in the first place, it might help us to recall how significant an event it was in light of the then recent history of Sino-American relations.
We must recognize that the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States have had great differences. We will have differences in the future. But what we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war.
On October 1st, 1949, after a protracted civil war that lasted nearly a quarter of a century, the victorious Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Mao's victory came as a surprise to both the United States and the Soviet Union, as both had assumed that the Chinese nationalists, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, would continue to rule China after the victory over Japan in World War II. And yet, 4 years after the surrender of Japan, the nationalists had been driven from the mainland to the island of Taiwan, where the Republic of China remains to this day. This was quite a reversal of fortunes for Mao Zedong, who from 1934 to 1935 had led the remnants of the Chinese Communist forces on what became known as the Long March, a fighting retreat from the nationalists in the south to the mountainous north of China. There they resided in the caves of Paoan, licking their wounds and biding their time until the defeat of Japan, when they resumed the Civil War and with an army of disaffected peasants took over the mainland. Mao, an anti-imperialist and Marxist-Leninist, immediately entered China into an alliance with the Soviet Union, traveling to Moscow in December of 1949 to pay homage to the Red Tsar. Much of Mao's subsequent cult of personality would be based on that of Stalin himself. The news of the loss of China sent shockwaves across America, as it came fast on the heels of the Soviet detonation of their first atomic bomb. The Cold War was in full swing, and American fears of an international communist conspiracy directed from Moscow had political ramifications at home. The House of Un-American Activities Committee began a witch hunt for communist subversives within American political and cultural life. This red baiting provided a means by which political hopefuls could build a reputation for themselves.
I invited them to give information of wrongdoing, graft, corruption, communism. I am continuing to get that information.
In 1950, after a series of highly publicized hearings and the discovery of microfilm stowed away in a pumpkin by the main witness, a former State Department official, Alger Hiss, was convicted of perjury for having denied under oath that he had been a Soviet agent during the 30s and early 40s. Hiss's accuser, Whittaker Chambers, was coached by a freshman congressman from California, Richard Nixon.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of very highly confidential, secret State Department documents. These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were...
Nixon had grown up in Whittier, California, the son of a failed citrus farmer and grocer. He would recall years later working as a boy in the pre-dawn hours of the morning, feeding the pot-bellied stoves that provide warmth for the oranges. Nixon worked his way through Duke University, and during World War II, he joined the Navy, where he earned the nickname Iron Ass for his preternatural ability to sit through long games of poker. His winnings would help pay for his first campaign for Congress in 1946. The Hiss affair catapulted Nixon to national office, and after serving as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, he finally got his chance to run for president himself, but narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy after a televised debate in 1960. He would never forget the role that television had played in his defeat. 2 years later, he lost the gubernatorial election to Pat Brown in California and declared to a stunned press corps,
"You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore."
His career seemed all but finished. Events would provide him another opportunity. Lyndon Johnson, who had succeeded JFK in 1963 after the latter's assassination, had overseen a massive American troop buildup in Vietnam, ostensibly to curb the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The war became unpopular, however, and Johnson refused to seek re-election in 1968, devoting the rest of his presidency to negotiating a ceasefire. Here, Nixon saw opportunity to stage the greatest comeback in American political history. Running as the Republican candidate for president, he announced he had a secret plan to end the war and achieve what he called peace with honor. In reality, Nixon, with the help of Henry Kissinger, had worked to undermine the Johnson administration's peace talks by convincing the South Vietnamese government that they would receive better terms in a ceasefire with Nixon as president. Nixon did win in 1968, but the war went on for another 4 years, until the Paris peace talks, which earned Henry Kissinger a Nobel Peace Prize, ended the war on the very same terms that were on the table in 1968. Things had not been so stable in the communist world either. After the death of Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev had undertaken a policy of de-Stalinification, in which monuments to the old dictator were removed, his body quietly buried, and his cult of personality denounced. This came as a shock to Mao, who had styled himself a Red Emperor along Stalinist lines. Of Khrushchev, Mao said, "He's just handing the sword to others, helping the tigers to harm us. If they don't want the sword, we do. The Soviet Union may attack Stalin, but we will not." The chairman believed that the USSR had betrayed its revolutionary pedigree, and as a result, China would have to become more independent of the Sino-Soviet alliance in order to save the worldwide communist movement. The next step for China, then, was purging it of rightists. After declaring, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend," Mao condemned anyone who came out against the party line. "Coax the snakes out of their holes to let the poisonous weeds grow first, and then destroy them one by one. Let them be fertilizer." Mao then set in motion one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in history, the Great Leap Forward. He ordered farmers to abandon their crops and make steel in shoddy backyard furnaces by burning their furniture and melting down their farm equipment. The resulting famine, which lasted from 1958 to 1961, claimed the lives of over 30 million people. The baby boom that followed World War II was an international phenomenon that went beyond the United States. By the 1960s and 70s, the first post-war generation was in its late teens and early 20s and was already posing a threat to the current Cold War system. In the United States, university students protested the Vietnam War, and in 1970, 5 days after the Kent State Massacre, an exasperated President Nixon went to the Lincoln Memorial to try and reason with the young people who held a vigil there. Nixon was nervous, and those present described him as being nearly incoherent, mumbling about Churchill, appeasement, football, his environmental policies, and why it's best to travel when you're young. The students were nonplussed. In China, however, Mao had found a way to channel the energies of the new generation towards his own ends. The Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966, turned China's youths into Red Guards, who laid siege to academic institutions and shouted down and sometimes tortured to death their teachers as suspected enemies of the Chinese Revolution. "I love great upheavals," said Mao at the time. His wife, the former actress Jiang Qing, took a prominent role in the Cultural Revolution. The ballet she produced, The Red Detachment of Women, features prominently in the second act of the opera. In 1969, fighting broke out between Soviet and Chinese forces along the Ussuri River. By summer, rumors were that the two great communist powers might go to war with one another, both armed with nuclear weapons. Mao confided to his doctor, "Think about this. We have the Soviet Union to the north and the west, India to the south, and Japan to the east. If all our enemies were to unite, attacking us from north, south, east, and west, what do you think we should do?" Mao continued with his answer. "Beyond Japan is the United States. Didn't our ancestors counsel negotiating with faraway countries while fighting with those who were near?" Mao's doctor asked in shock how this could be possible, since the United States had opposed the Chinese Communist Party from the beginning.
With the Red Army conquering China, fear-ridden Shanghai crowds see nationalist soldiers vent their fury upon suspected communist sympathizers who are executed in the streets with little ceremony.
Mao replied, "The United States and the Soviet Union are different. America's new president, Nixon, is a long-time rightist, a leader of anti-communists there. I like to deal with rightists. They say what they really think, not like leftists, who say one thing and mean another." In Washington, Nixon too saw opportunity to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. When asked what American policy would be if a shooting war began between the PRC and USSR, Nixon immediately declared that the interests of the United States were to preserve the PRC. This was a first, the president declaring that America's strategic interests were served by a communist state with which they had no contact to begin with. The stage was set for Nixon's outreach to China. He wagered that the trip would inspire fear in Moscow over a Sino-American alliance, as well as provide a means to end the war in Vietnam, as the North was receiving support from both China and the USSR. One thing was certain: any other president who proposed to go to China would have been labeled a pinko at best and a communist at worst. Nixon's history of red baiting made him untouchable in this regard, and led to the common saying, "Only Nixon can go to China." When we are introduced to President Nixon in the opera, he and the First Lady descend from Air Force One, where they meet the Premier, Zhou Enlai. Nixon and Zhou shake hands, a symbolic act, after the insult that John Foster Dulles gave to Zhou at the Geneva Accords in 1954, in which he refused to shake his hand. As Nixon goes down the line shaking hands with the dignitaries, he muses, in the form of an aria, that news has a kind of mystery. The repetition of news, the first word in the aria, emphasizes Nixon's preoccupation with how the event will be viewed on television screens all over the world. In fact, the press junket had flown ahead of Nixon to make sure that the cameras would be rolling as soon as the president's plane arrived. The aria further dramatizes Nixon's inward nature, as he frequently turns away from the dignitaries to address the audience directly with his own thoughts about the historical import of what he has accomplished. As Theodore White noted in his The Making of a President, 1972, over and over again, in any conversation with people in contact with the president, one was told how much this president craved solitude. He was short on small talk, and was awkward at it. He was impatient, and his mind was quick. He had a habit of hearing the first sentence of a visitor, then interrupting and finishing the visitor's thought quickly in his own words. Nixon also consciously draws parallels between himself and the Apollo astronauts, who in 1969 had become the first human beings to walk on the surface of the moon. Nixon had spoken to the Apollo 11 team via a telephone radio transmission.
I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth.
The president even quotes from the lunar plaque that was left on the surface of the moon, which bears his signature as well as those of Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. "We came in peace for all mankind."
I said we came in peace for all mankind, and I was put in mind of our Apollo astronauts, simply achieving a great human dream.
The president reflects upon the unsettled times over which he presides, and in a final evocation of the Apollo astronauts, he compares the ocean of distrust that stands between the United States and the People's Republic to the Sea of Tranquility, where the first lunar landing took place.
The Earth's sea of tranquility, tranquility. The Earth's sea
Nixon's thoughts begin to turn, however, and he begins to dream of rats gnawing at his bedsheets. The president's optimism gives way to paranoia, his tragic flaw, and foreshadows his political destruction in the wake of the Watergate scandal. Nixon is soon awakened by Kissinger, and the two are whisked away to their meeting with Chairman Mao. The character of Mao Zedong undergoes the greatest transformation of any other role in the opera. In the first act, he is a decrepit old man, still sharp in mind but weak in body, needing assistance to stand and sit, and occasionally dozing off mid-conversation. Throughout the talks, Mao and Nixon go back and forth, regarding the future of China and its place in an American-dominated global market. At a meeting of American and Chinese dignitaries, hosted by Zhou Enlai, Nixon raises a toast, declaring, "I oppose China. I was wrong."
I oppose to China. I oppose to China. I oppose to China. I was.
Nixon's wife, First Lady Pat Nixon, reflects on her life as a schoolteacher from a poor family, and espouses a fatalistic view of what will be, and that each day should be treated as special as if it were Christmas. One of the lasting legacies of the visit was when she saw a panda in captivity, and was so smitten with it, the Chinese offered to send one to the United States.
Hi.
Just checking to see how the panda thing went. I've been in a meeting, and so I wasn't able to
They
check.
were just darling.
Yeah, did they...
They raved about it.
As a result, the National Zoo in D.C. received its first great panda bear. In the third and final act, the chairman has been rejuvenated by the visit of the Americans, and literally emerges from his own image, where he reminisces about the glory days of the Chinese Revolution, and dances a foxtrot with his wife, Chiang Jing.
It was the time that tasty little starlet came into my tale.
As the couples retire, Zhou Enlai reflects upon a life of service, the cost to his family life, his lack of heirs, and his approaching death, and what it will mean for China.
I am old and cannot sleep forever.
John Adams, though considered a minimalist composer, drew from a variety of musical sources for Nixon in China. Elements of jazz are used alongside those of the agitprop theater. However, it is the minimalist component of the score that underlines the dominant themes of the opera. If you ask someone who knew almost nothing about music to describe minimalism, assuming that they had listened to it, the one thing they would come away with is its repetitions. One way to understand the rise of minimalism in the latter half of the 20th century is to see it in part as a response to the consumerism of Western capitalism. In Thomas Smith's Hints to Intending Advertisers, the author explains that the efficacy of advertisements is based largely on its being unrelentingly repetitious. The first time a man looks at an ad, he does not see it. The third time he looks at it, he becomes conscious of its existence. The fifth time he sees it, he reads it. The eighth time he sees it, he becomes annoyed with it. The 15th time he sees it, he counts his money. The 20th time he sees it, he buys it.
The Hamburger Happy Clown, a McDonald's drive-in restaurant, is his favorite place in town.
The opera's hero, President Nixon, has come to China to proselytize to the Chinese people about the virtues and repetitions of the capitalist system. When Nixon ran for governor of California, his opponents utilized flyers with his image and a caption that read, "Would you buy a used car from this man?" The president, with his attention to the finer details of PR and the role of media, is the consummate salesman. Mao's revolution, though it rejects capitalism in favor of socialism, employs almost exactly the same techniques. Mao's picture adorned almost every abode in China and dominates the public space of Tiananmen Square. Communist propaganda draws its effectiveness from the repetitions of party slogans, the ultimate example being the mass dissemination of Mao's Little Red Book to all citizens of the PRC. In the opera, the Red Detachment of Women serves as an interactive piece of propaganda, one in which the Nixons fall into, unable to keep themselves from intervening in what they perceive to be a righteous cause, either within the play or China itself. Even after the market reforms that followed Mao's death in 1976, his image has become as much a brand as it is a symbol of the international workers' movement. The greatest achievement of Nixon in China is that together the team of Adams, Goodman, and Sellers managed to depict the disgraced former president as a complex man of Shakespearean proportions. Nixon's deviousness, his secret diplomacy, had made possible the great achievements of his presidency. The opening of China, the SALT I Treaty with the Soviet Union, and the Vietnam ceasefire which followed the Paris Peace Accords. His greatest mistake, born of his paranoia, was that he could not distinguish those actions he could justify from those he could never justify if they ever came to light. Bombing Cambodia was one thing, but wiretapping political opponents at home was just too far. In 1974, Nixon resigned in disgrace and remains the only president to have done so.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The opera may very well be the closest thing to a lasting and honest memorial to the most complicated president of the 20th century.